This is Group Apollo 13.
So we had Apollo 13, and Apollo 13 was known as the successful failure because it was basically a success, basically a failure at the same time. And I'm Jamie Grasky.
I'm Becca Norris.
I'm Jake Makucha.
So a brief overview of Apollo 13. It was supposed to be the third lunar flight. The previous two missions, Apollo 12 and Apollo 11, were successful as well. And every astronaut returned home safely, so there was no loss of life. Apollo 13 was a 3-man mission. Oh, and this is actually pretty cool. So days before takeoff, one of the pilots got German measles, which is not fun. And then it spread to one of the module commanders. So yeah, it was just interesting. And yeah.
He was the only one that wasn't immune to it.
Oh.
So
Okay, so the mission objective was to realistically land safely on the moon again, and return back safely, not burning up in the atmosphere, coming back, just making sure everyone got to and from properly. The space crew accomplished one of those goals. They made it out there and back safely. They just did not land due to the oxygen tank exploding partially through the flight. They orbited and came back down. Apollo 13 was, it was only able to orbit the moon. Okay, so James Duvall, he was born on March 25th, 1928, always a good date, in Cincinnati, Ohio, or Cleveland. I don't know why I said Cincinnati, I was thinking of the Bengals. Okay. He was he was part of several historic flights, Gemini 7, 12, Apollo 8, and 13. He was the captain of the crew, and he was the one who said, Houston, we've had a problem. Not the way the movie says it, they messed up, they didn't follow it accurately. They said, Houston, we have a problem. That wasn't what was said.
So previous missions of the Apollo timeline. So Apollo 1, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. Apollo 1 had a problem on the launch pad. Apollo 7 was the first to orbit the Earth and was successful. And then Apollo 8 lunar orbit and returned successful. Apollo 9 was the first crewed lunar module test. And then Apollo 10 was lunar orbit and returned. So the oxygen tank from Apollo 13 that actually exploded came from Apollo 10. It was having a problem in Apollo 10. They took it out of Apollo 10, they fixed it, and then they put it into Apollo 13, and that's the one that bursted. So it's kind of ironic. Apollo 11 landed on the moon and returned successful. Apollo 12 landed on the moon and returned. And Apollo 13 was the successful failure because it didn't land on the moon. It just orbited and came back.
So how long it lasted? Apollo 13 lasted approximately 5 days. It was supposed to be longer, obviously, but the crew was supposed to be out because of the oxygen. At 55 hours, the crew began to notice this problem, and it was launched on April 11th, 1970, and it crashed April 17th, 1970. Crashed.
And when he says it only lasted that long, that's the amount of time it lasted in space.
In space, yeah.
That wasn't the entire project. It would have been crazy if they were able to do it in 5 days and 22 hours. That's a lot of all-nighters.
Okay, so the problems that the mission faced, it basically faced one problem after another. It wasn't just the oxygen tank. So before the mission even started, the Apollo 10 oxygen tank was damaged in the mission, then fixed up and put in the Apollo 13 or so that. There are a few minor problems, but Apollo 13 was looking like the smoothest mission yet. The crew was doing a live 49-minute broadcast on TV and how comfortable they were. They were all saying oh yeah, this is great, in space. And 9 minutes after their program, after the TV live thing stopped, Oxygen tank number 2, the one that was replaced from Apollo 10, exploded and caused the oxygen tank number 1 to fail as well. So there was a crack in oxygen tank number 1. And next, the warning lights came on about the loss of 2 of 3 fuel cells, which is the prime source of electricity for the rocket. And while this was happening, oxygen was being completely erased from one of the tanks.
Okay, so then 13 minutes after the explosion happened, Laval happened to look out the window and see some sort of gas coming out of the spacecraft. Like, yeah. So this was the oxygen from the second tank that had been damaged when the first tank had blown up. Well, oxygen tank number 2 blew up, and then it had cracked oxygen tank number 1. So it was starting to come out at a really rapid rate, and that was alarming because that was their main source of power to get back to Earth and get to the moon. So before Houston Control could give any instructions about anything, they had running in test simulators what could happen, what would happen if things like this would happen, and that's what they kind of had to act on. They had to act on prior knowledge, not really as much instruction from Houston.
Okay, so how are you gonna fix it? There was obviously no way to fix an oxygen tank in space because of the oxygen fluid. However, there were several different ways that the crew would be able to avoid running out of oxygen completely. The very first thing that they did was they discovered the leak, and then they found a way to close it, and this would make it so there would be less oxygen loss. The crew began to realize that they might need to use the lifeboat, which doesn't really make sense. But
Yeah, it's the LM lifeboat is what they were supposed to do to splash down into the
when
ocean, but they had to get into it earlier because of the problem. With only 50 minutes of power left in the CM, which is their main area, the controller told the crew to move to the LM. The LM was only built for 45 minutes, so the last 45 minutes of their flight they were supposed to go to the LM. They needed to be 90 minutes in there. So oxygen wasn't the problem in the LM because there was plenty of tanks, and because they didn't actually land on the moon, they actually had their own tanks to spare too. So oxygen wasn't the problem anymore. But the only concern left amongst the crew was if there was enough power in the LM to make it back.
Alright, so the risk was major after the tanks exploded. It was their lives. That was probably one of the biggest risks they had, and they all knew going up space. Yes, they had several successful missions, but it's always a risk when you go somewhere. Also, whether or not the LM would last the whole 90 minutes or just the 45 minutes that it was supposed to last, and then it needed to be perfect. Everything they did from that point had to be precise and had to be just absolute. One mess up, it could have gone completely different.
So the crew was aboard the LM lifeboat when they splashed down into the water, of course. This was an achievement as the crew was able to ration their supplies, their different water supplies and food supplies. But they were given clear instructions from Houston Control on how they were going to return safely. Before Houston gave them any instructions at all, they had a simulator that they were testing with other people before they gave them instructions so that they were precise and that it would help them get back. The LM didn't have a good navigation system, so Lavelle had to follow the instructions to be able to get back on course and navigate safely home.
Okay, so how they were able to ration? Is that, okay.
Yeah, it's called ration.
Okay. That's not but they had to save mostly water because you need to be hydrated, but at the same time you had to make sure you had enough to make it all the way back. It didn't have, well, it also had to make sure the LM didn't overheat on its way back, so again, rationing water. the crew became dehydrated because they had to save the water, which is kind of not the greatest circumstances. They only ate food that was soaked in water, that way they could at least get some sort of water into them, conserving most of it for the LM. So they ate like hot dogs, various fruits, things like that that could be put into water. Water was the only consumable. Of course, I was in any sort of trouble. They planned it for a smooth mission. Well, that's expensive. They had to cut down to 6 ounces, which is about a ninth or
That's
six.
1/5, I think.
1/5, okay, 1/5, okay. 1/5 of the normal intake. That's
Weight loss, so this is, referring to begins. They lost over, well, this kind of gentleman lost over 14 pounds, which is a lot if you think about it. The whole crew lost a total of 31.5 pounds altogether. And this is obviously due to the low amounts of water that they were able to drink and the amount of food they had.
How Apollo 13 affected future missions. So Apollo 13 provided key research and evidence to NASA on making the rockets better, obviously. So they know that they probably shouldn't use a broken tank from a previous mission. It also gave courage to future astronauts on how to overcome adversity. If the astronauts were in the TM or the LM lifeboat for more than one day, it would have been catastrophe. And adversity makes people stronger.
Okay, so
Hey, you want to Control-C, Control-V that for me, right there?
wait, hold on, I got it.
It's not,
Here, watch out. I got
you
this.
got this. So,
Didn't let me put it in as a So yeah, everyone likes Tom Hanks, but this is from the movie, which is how people actually know about really Apollo 13. It's not really discussed that much. So basically, that's Houston. They're not really nothing. It was actually supposed to be one of the most successful at this point. Like nothing was going on at all, and so they're all just kind of relaxing, just doing their normal thing. Yeah, having a cigarette, just enjoying it. And then this is when stuff starts to get bad.
Oxygen tank blows,
Tom Hanks goes crazy.
and well, down goes one.
And so, as you can see, they're starting to see the warning lights about different things. Tom Hanks is reacting pretty quickly. They're starting to see at Houston that he's got a problem. And that's when Tom Hanks says the key line, he says it wrong. So that's the error in the movie, is we've had a problem, and he says we have a problem. So the crew's acting pretty immediately, definitely checking everything out, seeing what they should do. So they're giving them instructions on what they should do, where they should go, how they should save the oxygen. Okay, you can cut it now. You don't have to
Okay,
watch
she's
this.
come back to the slides.
It's probably almost over.
Okay, so clearly Apollo 13 had a movie based on it, inaccurate, but nonetheless, it was a movie. But this is, Apollo 13 movie was basically how the whole world found out and kind of really realized what went on in Apollo 13. Surprisingly, you would have thought people would have picked up on it. Many people thought that the crew had died on the mission. They didn't. They survived. There were no injuries, surprisingly, after a splashdown landing. And they knew they were dehydrated.
Oh, success and failure or both. Like we said, it's known for its success. You know what it's known for, right? Okay. Obviously the success was going into space and orbiting the moon, but the failure was obviously the oxygen tank and how we took it from Apollo 10 and 13. That was definitely a failure on us. And so that's how it's known as a success or failure, because it was both. Yeah, so that's basically.
And in conclusion, Apollo 13 was known as a successful failure of the Apollo series. It could have ended in tragedy, but due to the courage and knowledge of the crew, it successfully returned to Earth. All 3 crew members came back to Earth unharmed, but dehydrated due to them saving the water so they could use it on LM. The crew overcame adversity, and even if they